Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this masterclass about how can a red team evaluate the ROI of your security program. Before I pass you over to our host for today's session, I'll just quickly run you through our house rules. If you've attended the CIISec webinars before, then you will already be aware of the house rules, but if you haven't, you will be muted throughout the duration of the masterclass, but the chat function is available, so please put any questions that you do have into the chat box. Hopefully you won't experience any problems, but if you do, please email support@ciisec.org and someone will be able to assist you. I'll now hand you over to our host for today's masterclass, John Davis, MBE, who is the Director at Pervade Software. John will get us started for today's session before handing us over to Mike to give us his presentation.
Super, thanks very much indeed. I appreciate that. And hello, everybody. And thanks very much for joining us today for another masterclass session. And masterclasses really are a bit of a deep dive into various topics. And this time it's going to be a really hot topic, which is all about red teaming. So first of all, a little bit about me. As you've just been told, I run a small cybersecurity software company. And we actually provide the platform for the police cyber alarm. We also provide the platform for the UK's Cyber Essentials scheme, and we work with the military. Now, working with the military, along with an awful lot of people in the cyber industry, we've got a lot of veterans and a lot of ex-military people in the industry. I'm a veteran, but I'm also a serving reservist. And red teaming is really familiar to me, even back to when I first joined up in the armed forces, because the whole concept of red teaming comes from wargaming, and wargaming in the context of trying to plan out what's likely to happen in a military campaign before you launch into it. So before you send your tanks and your people running into battle, that battle will probably have been fought numerous times on a huge, great big table or a board, either with some modeling or with just tabletop and handwritten. But one way or another, it will have been wargamed multiple times. That concept of wargaming means that as the name implies, with gaming, you're going to be using teams, and those teams are the red team. You have the blue team, who are renowned for being the goodies. But you also, in the military, you have green team, which means it's the rest of the armed forces. You have brown team, which means it's associated but not military. White teams, a whole range of different teams. And when wargaming is done correctly, it's a really effective way of effectively doing scenario planning, what if planning, and what's possible, what could work and what might not work. So in the military today, the MOD actually have a red teaming handbook, and it's used in wargaming, but they've taken that same doctrine and applied it into military planning and preparation, and also reviewing of their current doctrine. So, for example, in the Ministry of Defence Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre, that's a bit of a mouthful, but they're the ones that effectively determine practice and policy. That this guide is used to help people plan on a day-to-day basis. And the same is true in the US Armed Forces. They've got a combined arms center, which teaches red teaming, not just from that practical, how do you do it, from wargaming through to using it in your pre-planning sessions, where you're just doing fact-finding about what are our threats and risks and what might happen, what might not happen, so that you can put that into your planning. They also apply it to the psychology of problem solving and the psychology of planning. So they apply red teaming techniques, once you've learned them, into the mental approach to planning and problem solving. So this is what's going on in the military, where all of this red teaming was evolved initially. This has been taken along with a whole bunch of other concepts from the military and from defense into the cyber community, where we are fighting that red team, blue team war. Of course, we're talking about red teaming here in the context of people acting as a red team, but the red team is effectively every hacker out there. And using that to change the methodologies, change the psychology, the approach, and some of the practices in terms of how we prepare for planning out a new infrastructure, updating an infrastructure, determining how well our infrastructure is performing, etc. Now, we're going to learn an awful lot in the next 45, 50 minutes or so about exactly how that's done and the kind of people that do it in the field, in the real world. And while we're picking up on that and looking at it from a cyber perspective, just think in terms of this as a conflict, this as a warfare of sorts, because the cyber warfare is considered now to be the fifth domain, land, sea, and air, with the three domains of warfare that we're very familiar with. That's where we've got our Army, Navy, and Air Force. Space was added as a domain of warfare a little while ago, and cyber is now the fifth of the domains of warfare. So it is very real for military and nation state, and it can be really made to be real in a cost-effective and really positive way within businesses by organizations such as the one that our speaker comes from today. So I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce the company name because I'll get it wrong. I'm from Wales, so I would look at that and call it Dionach, but I'm sure it's pronounced slightly differently. And we're really, really pleased today to have a senior consultant from Dionach with us. And we're going to be picking up on some of these amazing tips and hints from Mike. Mike, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, if you would, and then dive straight into your presentation. If anyone's got any questions, throw them into the chat, and we'll pick them up at the end. But over to you, Mike.
All right, thank you so much for this introduction. I am a principal consultant in Dionach, and I've been working for them for a number of years, around 10 years now. So first of all, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for joining this session with me. Today we are going to talk about Red Team and how it can help organization in evaluating the return of investment in security programs. The plan is for today is, first of all, we are going to do the red teaming, and we can compare it to more traditional cybersecurity assessments such as pen testing. We are going through then a real example, an actual red team assessment that we perform against one of our customers. Along the way, we're going to discuss the key points that will help us to understand the return of investments of organizations in terms of cybersecurity. And finally, we'll go through the conclusions and takeaways. First of all, what is a real red team assessment? It's a real-life simulated cyber attack. It confirms whether organizations' most critical assets can be compromised by an external attacker. And along the way, we test the detection and the response capabilities of the organization of our customers. And sometimes we discover security flaws that typically are not be detected with traditional pen tests. I'm going through a couple of examples later on in this presentation. Red teaming is also what we call it a multidisciplinary exercise because it involves elements of threat intelligence, penetration testing, and social engineering. Red teaming is something in the middle of these three exercises. So let's have a look at the main differences between pen testing and red teaming. So first of all, the scope is different. Primarily during an penetration test, the client defines and provides the scope. Typically, it's just URLs pointing to a web application, for example, or IP addresses or network ranges. During red team assessment, the scope is the entire organization as a whole. Everything is in the organization, is in scope. Also, the duration is different. Usually, pen testing lasts less than 2 weeks. Obviously, there are exceptions, but as a general rule, they last less than 2 weeks. Whereas red teaming assessment are spread out through among several months. Also, awareness. When we perform a penetration test, everyone within the organization, our customers, they know about the test. They also want to know, for example, the IP addresses where we perform the scans from, and so on. Whereas when we perform a red team assessment, only specific individuals are aware of the red team assessment, typically the CTO. Also, the execution times are different. Traditional pen testing are carried out during working hours, whereas red team assessment, essentially, we perform an attack at any time that we want. Finally, the goals are different. Traditional pen testing, typically, the goal is to find as many vulnerabilities as possible within the time that we have. Whereas red team assessment, during the red team assessment, we want to prove that sensitive data can be compromised, and along the way, we test the detection response capabilities of our customers. Now, if everything looks a little bit difficult to understand, let's have a look analogy. Imagine that you have gold inside a mansion, and your goal is to protect that gold. One approach could be testing individual elements of the mansion, such as testing the security of the main entrance, or perhaps checking the windows and so on. Alternatively, you could consider the mansions as a whole in the scope of the engagement, giving freedom to the tester on how they want to break into the mansion. This flexibility will inevitably give the opportunity to uncover and reveal vulnerabilities that necessarily were not thought initially at the beginning of the engagement. For example, the tester might try to break into the mansions through the roof, or maybe through the back garden. Now that we have a grasp on red teaming, let's have a look at the phases of a red team assessment. Initially, we define with the customer the goals of the engagement, and they typically want to see if we can compromise a specific server or a specific system or a specific application. When the predefined objectives are defined, are agreed, we move on with the first phase of the red team engagement. The first phase is called reconnaissance, and the purpose of this phase is to discover vulnerable system resources, employees, anything that is exposed externally. At this stage, we don't perform any attack whatsoever. Then we plan the attack. So the next step is the initial compromise phase. The goal of this phase is to obtain an initial communication, an initial foothold inside the organization network. Once that communication is established, we want to make sure that that communication channel between us as attackers and the organization network, we want to make sure that communication channel is stable and reliable. After that, we move to the privilege escalation phase. The initial access typically is via a low privileged account. So during this phase, we want to make sure that we have the highest level of privileges within the organization network. So we want to escalate our level of privileges during this phase. Once we have done that, we move on to the next phase, which is the lateral movement. And during this phase, essentially we are after the targets that we predefine. Once we reach the target, we move on to the next phase, which is the data exfiltration phase. And during this phase, we want to extract and take a copy of the data of the targets that we predefine. We want to take a copy out of the organization boundaries. So these are the main phases of red team assessment. But let's look at a real example, which hopefully will help us to understand how a red team assessment is properly carried out. This is an example, and it comes from a real engagement. So we were being approached by an organization that were very mature in terms of cybersecurity. They had a security operations center running 24/7, and they also have EDR, so endpoint detection response agents, deployed across the network. So the first phase obviously was to define the goals of the red team assessment. Our customer wanted to see if we could compromise a secret network and exfiltrate data out of that network. And also, they want us to test the SOC and EDR agents to understand if they were a good investment. So let's see how we tackle this organization. So we started with the initial phase, so the reconnaissance phase. During this phase, we look for public information such as office addresses. Obviously, we look at the company's website, and sometimes we found people that work for that specific organization, and that those people are potential targets. We also look for any external systems that the organization exposed. Like in this particular case, they had Citrix exposed externally. We also look for information on social media, but also we look on, for example, suppliers. And interesting enough, in this case, we found the floor plan from the website of the construction company. Just to basically, this is quite important because essentially not necessarily the information's hosted and managed by our customers are what they control. Sometimes also suppliers have got information related to other organizations. Then, as part of the reconnaissance phase, we also search for leaked credentials. So leaked credentials are, this type of credentials are from third-party websites. They are being compromised. It's not unusual for people to use corporate email addresses to register on third-party websites, such as on suppliers' website. And it's not unusual that people use the same credentials across multiple systems and services. In this case, we found about 100 leaked credentials related to our customers, and they were a combination of username and password or username and password hashes. Password hashes, we tried also to crack these password hashes and retrieve the clear text credentials. Another technique that also is quite effective is called domain squatting. Essentially, we register a domain that is very similar to the target. And so, for example, assuming that our target has got that domain, not securebank.com, as part of this attack, what we do, we register a very similar domain, like notsecurebank.co. And you'll be surprised, essentially, because we own that domain, we can create email forwarding rules to capture any email to that specific domain, to notsecurebank.co. And you'll be surprised at the amount of information that we can passively gather by simply receiving emails with typo. That type of information includes attachments, PDFs, and so on. So now we finished the first phase of the red team assessment. We finished the reconnaissance phase. So it's important to take a step back and think about the return of investment of the organization in cybersecurity. First of all, what we can consider is, did the threat intelligence service discover public resources that we identified, such as leaked credentials, flow plans, or even squattable domains? These are the type of questions that we ask at the end of the red team assessment engagement, and they help the customer to understand if the ROI was poor or good. Also, another question could be, was cybersecurity training sufficient? For example, did the staff, were they aware that essentially they shouldn't use corporate email addresses on third-party website because those third-party website could be compromised at some point? So after that, we move to the next phase, the initial compromise phase. And now is when things are getting a little bit more interesting, I would say. So the next step that we typically do is an attack called credential stuffing. Considering that we had a few credentials from the leaked databases, we typically try those credentials across all the systems that our customers have exposed externally. That included Microsoft 65, Citrix, or any custom portals. Unfortunately for us, but fortunately for them, they had multi-factor authentication enabled on these services. But obviously, we didn't stop here. So we discovered that our customer was using Exchange. That's quite common nowadays. And what we discovered is they were using Exchange servers on premises. The problem was that you can access Exchange via multiple ways, and you can see those in this slide. The problem was that ActiveSync didn't enable multi-factor authentication. And as far as I'm aware, it's not really possible, or it's not easy, I would say, to implement multi-factor authentication on ActiveSync for Exchange servers on premises. So we found that. We found essentially we could access emails of one victim by simply using a mobile app, the Outlook mobile app, enter those credentials that we discovered during the information gathering phase, and we had our initial access to the victim's inbox. So at this stage, we could access emails, but not only that, because via the mobile app, we could access the calendar of that victim. And, you know, people tend to send credentials via emails. And we could also discover that by simply search for password inside the victim's inbox. That was quite interesting. We also noticed that the victim was receiving several emails from Microsoft Outlook. And when we open one of those emails, we noticed that essentially the email was notifying the user of an access from an enrolled device, our device. The victim also requested to support to the IT department. They said, hey, guys, I've received 10 of these emails. Can you give me help, essentially? Eventually, the victim no longer received those emails. That's what we noticed. Interesting. So we finished the phase of the initial compromise, and now we can take another step back and think about the return of investment of our customers in terms of cybersecurity. First of all, we asked, did the SOC that you have, the 24/7 SOC, did they detect unauthorized access with via ActiveSync? And assuming they detect something, did the blue team perform any action? Did they try to trace back to my phone, our device? And did internal or third-party reviews include of all entry points with a view of enforcing MFA? This is quite important because I will stress that with traditional pen testing and auditing, it's very difficult to, for example, identify that legacy protocol, the active sync protocol enable, which allowed us to gain access to emails without multi-factor authentication. So that's great. We had our initial access to the organization network. Well, I would say to the organization emails. And what we want to do, we want to move to the next phase, which is the lateral movement. But now let's recap a second the information there, or the level of access that we obtained so far. We had valid domain credentials, but unfortunately, because the client was enforcing multi-factor authentication on Citrix, we couldn't access their network. However, we had access to emails and calendars. And we noticed that the victim received several emails from about Microsoft ActiveSync issues. So the next step, so what we decided to do as the next step was to impersonate an IT guy in order to lure the victim into accepting the MFA push notification. That's what we wanted to do. So the next attack was something called phishing. It was basically phishing via a telephone call. And our pretext was similar to what you can see in the slide. So we called the victim, which we knew the credentials, and we say, hey, we have noticed some synchronization issue with your phone. Please let us help you. And then we said, in order to ensure that Exchange server is synced properly, we're going to send you a notification, and please accept the notification via your phone. And we could send a notification because, as I said before, we had valid credentials and we could log in on Citrix, but obviously we didn't have an MFA device enrolled properly, so we couldn't pass that stage. So as soon as the victim accepts the notification, we decide to immediately enroll our device, because Dual Security gives you that option at that time. And so as soon as we had access, we enrolled our device in order to ensure that we still have, we had persistent access on the network. And as soon as we managed to enroll our device, obviously at that stage, we had our proper access to the corporate network. Like in this case, it was via Citrix. So we could access the victim's emails as before through the mobile phone, but this time it was via Citrix. So we had, essentially, we passed the level of trust there was between an untargeted source and also a target source. So at this stage, we could read emails, but also we could access data on the network shares. And now we kind of completed the lateral movement phase. So let's think again about the return of investment for that customer. So again, when we finished our red team assessment, we approached them and we asked them, did the SOC detect no corporate device being enrolled? Like in this case was our device. And obviously the answer was no. We also, obviously, because they didn't detect anything, the blue team didn't perform any action. But also we asked that question, in case, assuming detection, what would your blue team have done? Would they have done anything differently? Would they have traced down the enrolled device in some shape or form? But also we asked the question about social engineering and training in order to understand if they were sufficient. The victim, for example, at that time didn't ask any sort of verification of our identity. They didn't ask our names. We just present ourselves, our ID, and that was enough for us to establish that level of trust between us and the victim. Then we move on to the privilege escalation phase. And then it's when probably things are getting a little bit more technical now. So typically, in order to compromise a Windows domain, the steps for escalations are the following. So usually we start with a domain user, like in this case, the account we compromised was just a standard domain user. And then the next step is to trying to gain local administrator access somewhere in the network. And finally, jump trying to become domain administrator. When you are domain administrator within Windows Active Directory domain, essentially you have pretty much unrestricted access through the entire network. Luckily for us, the user that we compromised was a member of a local administrator group in 3 servers. And that was quite interesting for us. We couldn't RDP, so we couldn't log in remotely to those servers because they had multi-factor authentication enabled even for remote desktop access. And that's quite unusual because at this stage we were already inside the network. But obviously we managed to bypass the check through PowerShell remoting, and that allowed us to dump local hashes. In the image, you can see that we're trying to extract the SAM hive through the Windows registry and the system hive. Those are the 2 registries that you need in order to extract the local password hashes. So with the local password hash of one server, we decided to perform a password spray attack and trying to identify other systems that were using the same credentials with other systems with the same credentials. What we discovered was that all the CIISec VDIs were reusing the same credentials. So all the local administrators of the CIISec servers had the same password. We also dumped the Active Directory, and by doing so, we discovered that the client was using a name convention for all privileged accounts. All the privileged accounts were using all the privileged accounts were appending. They were using _domain admin. They were appending that to the username. So what we wanted to do at this stage, that we had local admin access, we want to gain domain administrator access. So the easiest way was to identify where domain administrators were logged on the VDIs, because at that stage we had local admin access on the VDIs, and jump on the VDIs and then dump the LSAS process. If you're not aware what LSAS process is, very simply, it's a Windows process that stores credentials in memory, such as password, NT or LM hashes, or even Kerberos tickets. So once we identified the domain administrator, the VDI where the domain administrator were logged in at that time, we decided to jump on the VDI and dump the LSAS process, and we copied the LSAS dump locally, and we extract the credentials with a tool called Mimikatz, and that gave us domain administrator credentials. So this is quite important phase of the entire path of all the phases within the red team assessment. Because we performed a large number of attacks For example, we performed the password hash attack. We dumped LSAs from memory. We jumped across multiple systems with PowerShell remoting. All these activities, they should have detected by the SOC. They should have created alerts. And after the red team assessment, we had a chance to understand exactly what alerts are being created by the SOC. And we helped the SOC to improve also the detections. Also, we again spoke with our customer, the blue team of our customers, so the IT department, and we explained how they should have reacted. Because even though the Security Operations Center managed to create some alerts and notify the blue team, unfortunately, the blue team didn't follow up. And we managed to dump the LSAS process. Nobody essentially stopped us from dumping these LSAS from memory. Also, we ask questions similar to this one. Were these misconfigurations flagged in the last internal penetration test? These are activities that typically are performed also with traditional penetration tests, like pass the hash is a very common technique. And if so, were they not, why were they not actioned? Why were they not fixed? Finally, we move into one of the last phase, the data exfiltration. So at this stage, we had domain administrator access through the entire network. And so this is an example that we had access to all the servers, all the virtual servers they had deployed within the environment. But really, the main target for this red team assessment was to access the secret network, okay? So the next step for us, what we decided to do was to try to target, we tried to target the IT team. And the reason for that was because IT team, usually they have access pretty much to everything within the network. So we noticed that the IT department was using KeePass. KeePass is just a password wallet where you can store credentials. And we use a tool called KeyThief to extract the password wallet, the password of the wallet from memory. And this literally gave us access to the entire kingdom. So not only domain admin access, within the KeePass, we could access even third-party suppliers, websites, and so on. So let's see how we moved from this level of access to the secret network. By doing very simple networking gathering, we discovered that the domain controller had unrestricted access to the secret network. The smile there is because it wasn't that secret. That secret network wasn't that secret in the end. So just to explain the full attack path, we had a device. We could access the network through the Citrix VDI because we managed to enroll our own device. Then we jumped to the domain controller because we could perform a privilege escalation attack. And then eventually we moved to the secret network. The important thing in here was that essentially the secret network, the server on the secret network was not joined to the corporate Active Directory domain. They were part of a completely different domain. However, thanks to the credentials that we discovered in KeePass inside the password wallet, we could access the Citrix network quite easily through the domain controller. So once we had access to the Citrix network, then it was just a matter of taking screenshots and prove that we had indeed access to confidential information. And these are just a couple of examples. We also found the PIN number of debit card. So again, ROI considerations, return on investments consideration. The main question was, did the SOC detect that confidential information were indeed extracted and compromised from the secret network? And this is a very important question because most of our customers, they don't have a way to test the detection capability of a security operations center. And that really, that's the main purpose of having all red team assessment. Because by doing this type of exercise, we can indeed answer that question. And also we can answer the question if, okay, the SOC perhaps did the correct way. They detected our compromise to the secret network. But what did the blue team do? Did they actually manage to stop us from accessing the secret network? And obviously the answer was no. And finally, we knew the answer to that question. Was network segregated sufficiently enforced? Well, the answer was no, because obviously once you have domain admin access, you can jump to the domain controller, and then from there you can jump to the secret network. So once we finished the red team assessment, we also map all the activities that we performed against the MITRE ATT&CK framework. This helps the customer to understand the type of attack we perform and how it should be detected. Obviously, at the end of the red team assessment, we go through our recommendations. We deliver, or typically we deliver operational, tactical, and strategic recommendation based on the result of the red team assessment, which is in this case where, first of all, make sure you implement multi-factor authentication everywhere. And if there is no way of enforcing MFA on ActiveSync, disable the legacy protocol. Then ensure that you have EDRs deployed everywhere. Unfortunately, during the red team assessment, we identified some of the servers that didn't have EDR installed. Also, we recommended our customer to reduce the number of domain admins. And that also the reason why we managed to discover one domain admin logged on a VDI. Finally, forest isolation and network segregation. Okay, they were using a different Active Directory domain, which was totally segregated from the main domain. However, it wasn't sufficiently segregated, because once you have domain admin access on domain controller, you can easily have an access to the secret network. Then we can move on to the tactical recommendation, and these are more long-term recommendations. So the client, our customer, were not performing regular training and phishing awareness. And also it's quite important to perform password audits. Along those leaked credentials that we found on breach databases, there were a few password hashes that we could crack. And finally, the strategic recommendation, which in this case were improve the alerting and monitoring based on the indicator of compromise that we reported, and improve the incident response processes. These were primarily for the blue team. Nowadays, and this is more like a recommendation that I would like to give to people in general. What we have experienced in the last years it was a shift from on-premise solutions to cloud environments. Previously, with on-premises solutions, we noticed that there was the concept of VPN as a primary source of identifying what is trust, what is not trust. Thanks to the cloud environments, nowadays we can move away from that principle and enforce the zero trust principle. We should adopt this principle, which enforce security controls every time an access is granted. Most cloud environments offer this solution, so we strongly recommend to consider this approach when you are implementing an infrastructure. Final slide. So this one just to say that we proved to our customer that we could access the target that we initially defined. We also test the detections and response capabilities, which in this case, unfortunately, they were not sufficient. We also provide an evidence-based risk profile, especially for C-level executives. And also, we discover security flows that typically are not discovered with traditional penetration tests. And with that sentence, I imply the active sinks, the lack of multi-factor authentication on active sinks. And finally, we help the customer to evaluate the return of investment of a cybersecurity program, because at the end of this assessment, our customer was in a position to say, okay, our initial investment on this security operation sentiment was not enough. So we need to tackle this situation and make sure that we can protect our organization better. And finally, I didn't mention that at the beginning, but obviously these are real. We want to mimic real cybersecurity attacks, but at the same time, we don't want to disrupt normal business operation. And thankfully, during this engagement, normal business operations were not affected. And that's it, really. That was my last slide. I'm open to any questions.
Absolutely fantastic. Thanks very much, Mike. And a lot of information covered there. I'm gonna kick it off with a question, actually, because I'm the organizing people, so I get to choose who goes first. So actually, my question is, the way you described this particular red team exercise, there was an end goal. It was that hidden or secret network that you were supposed to find and get onto and pivot onto in some way, or penetrate in some way. How many times do you conduct red team exercises which are just fishing trips? They're just let's get on there and see what we can find, get on, pivot, see what's there, and get the lie of the land, etc. Or would you consider that kind of exploratory operation not to be defined enough to be a red team exercise? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, this one is just one typical common attack path that we managed to gain an initial compromise into the corporate network. So for this one particularly, we heavily based our initial compromise on phishing and the credentials that were exposed through leaked breaches databases, sorry. But I will say that obviously that's not the only way in to compromise an organization. We sometimes find typical vulnerabilities that are for penetration tests, like SQL injection and so on. So really, red teaming, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, is a multidisciplinary exercise. It involves elements of threat intelligence because we need to perform the information gathering at the beginning in order to understand what is exposed externally. And then we use elements of penetration testing because sometimes, as I mentioned, we could potentially exploit an SQL injection and have our initial foothold through that vulnerability. But also we can take advantage of phishing and social engineering in general. So it's really, I would say, it's a more opportunistic approach that we use during the team assessment. We go after low-hanging fruits because those are the way that let us to gain access into the network, and probably those are the main things that our customers want to address initially. They want to make sure that the more easy ways to get in, they want to fix those vulnerabilities first before moving into more complex attack paths. I hope I answer your question, sorry. Sorry, we can't hear you.
There you go. That's better. So it makes perfect sense because, you know, in a lot of cases, organizations don't really know what they want tested. I mean, the number of times we walk into a client and we say, well, what do you like? And they say, well, test everything. Yeah. And it's like, well, yeah, you know, there's an awful lot of work there. And actually, you know, a lot of it doesn't need testing. But I think this idea of, well, test everything, tell me where my weaknesses are across everything, is really a sign that they don't know their own network well enough at that stage to know where their potential weak spots are.
Exactly.
Yeah, or they haven't done a sufficient prioritization in their risk assessment to know that there is a secret network. I mean, that secret network could well be the database of all of the databases. It's the database that actually has all of the really, really sensitive data on it, you know, the financial data or whatever. And how often are you working with companies that know what they're doing and know what they want versus companies that don't know what they want? What's the split there?
Yeah, I would say it's like 50-50%.
Oh, wow, really?
Sorry?
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, because okay, the smallest the organization is, typically they know what they want and what they have. So perhaps they want to do you know, penetration test to the only application they own. But the bigger the organization are, it's more likely they don't know exactly what they have, either internally or exposed externally. And that also comes as a surprise for me as well, most of the times, because if you are a CTO of an organization and you don't know what actually is exposed externally, you have a big problem, I think.
Yeah, no, indeed. And yeah, do you think there's value in doing a kind of a basic vulnerability test or just a basic penetration test that really only looks for those vulnerabilities? Once it's found them, it says, well, I've done my job. It writes them on a report and sends it in. They don't actually attempt to get through utilizing those vulnerabilities. They're just saying this vulnerability exists. Is there mileage in doing that before a red team exercise to give companies that awareness, or is that something that you can do at the beginning of, the early phases of a red team contract? Is that something that you get involved in?
Yeah, I don't think there is really a perfect rule on that. I think it depends on case by case. But in general, I would say that probably, you know, penetration testing and vulnerability assessment are good because they will help you to identify as many vulnerabilities as possible, really. Whereas the team assessment is more about trying to compromise the organization. So we might miss other vulnerabilities, for example, as part of the team assessment. because what we want to do is we want trying to reach the target, and we want to do it in the most efficient way. So, I mean, in cybersecurity, obviously there isn't only one solution, right? Security is a process in the end of the day. So I would suggest our customers to perform regular pen testing, but also include red teaming as part of the cybersecurity program, because pen testing can address vulnerabilities that are not identified during red team assessment, and red team assessment comes from a different perspective, and they will be able to identify things that were not even in scope of a penetration test, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's really interesting, because that's how those things coexist, and really they coexist at that front end of what would be a red team exercise, because the penetration test would end at a point that where red team would continue and would at least take some of those vulnerabilities and attempt to achieve the objective as a result, and actually penetrate, which is terrific. So we're talking there about the constructs at the beginning of the exercise. Mark Gooch has actually asked a question in the Q&A, which is more to do with the end of the exercise, and his question is, how did the target company in your use case here use the results of the exercise to better their cyber resilience moving forward? What do you know what they did with that?
Yes, of course, because we also help them to talk with the Security Operations Center and trying to explain all the activities that we performed that were not detected. So their team assessment results was essentially a form of helping them to talk with the Security Operations Center and help them to establish their level of trust, and trying to basically say, hey, during this exercise, these activities were performed. However, we haven't received any detections from your side. It's not unusual to say that sometimes we have customers that they also use their team assessment to properly evaluate the Security Operations Center. And if the results of their if the result of their team assessment are not, are not great. So, for example, nothing was detected or stopped, then the team assessment can be used as an excuse or a way to essentially move away from the Security Operations Center and go for other providers. Because unfortunately, there isn't a way to easily evaluate security software or security programs and so on. The only way to evaluate them is to put them on a test, okay? It's similar to a car, okay? You can basically make sure the car is fixed properly, but you have to do crash test in the end to make sure that your car can survive to a crash.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. That's a good one. We like that. Talking about crashing networks, etc. So one of the things that struck me as you got towards the end of the presentation was there was some really good in-depth discussion and descriptions of the tools you used. You were talking about very specific tools like Mimikatz and others, which are absolutely classic kind of hacking tools that are out there. And I think it's really important that blue teamers and network defenders understand and can function and can use and appreciate the capabilities of the tools that the hackers will use. So, you don't need something like a Mimikatz when you're running a network or attempting to defend a network. You'd use it either because you were attacking it or because you were penetration testing it. Do you think there's enough of this kind of crossover where network defenders and blue teamers are encouraged to actually go and utilize these tools to understand their capabilities more?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. I mean, we use open source tools for that particular reason. Because if we use property tools, it might be possible that the blue team, they don't want to buy the license, so they cannot mimic exactly the type of attacks we perform. We have obviously we use obviously a combination of open source tools and also some private tools as well. However, we're trying to push our team assessment to use open source tools because for that particular reason, because the blue team can also recreate those type of attacks and simulate those attacks and see if they can detect anything inside the network. And this is the valuable point also of the red team assessment, because it's also it's a way to basically teach the blue team in getting better and improving the detection capabilities. So, for example, in the example of Mimikatz, well, in this particular example, actually, we copied the LSAS dump out of the organization network, and we use Mimikatz locally. However, what the type of attack that we did was dumping the LSAS process, and that for sure will generate event logs in Windows. And for sure, they should have monitored those logs and act upon this attack immediately, because normal users don't dump LSAS process, right?
Yeah, fair point. Yeah, fair point. And a really good example as well, actually, of knowledge on the blue team side would have led them to look at different things than they would have, and to be aware of different things because of knowledge or appreciation for the capabilities of the tools that are being used, the weapons that are being used against them. So really good example, actually. Thank you. We've just reached the end of our time, so unfortunately we could probably go on with questions because it's such a rich area, and your talk actually was end to end. It really did cover absolutely everything, which means that we could deep dive into any one of those areas. So really good presentation. Thank you ever so much, Mike. Much appreciated, and terrific work. I'm sure there's a whole load of people listening in now that are thinking, okay, yeah, I thought I had a really good, exciting, juicy career in cyber, and now they've discovered red teaming is a thing. They want to go and change jobs, because it does sound like a much sexier version of a lot of the stuff that we all do on a day-to-day basis. So thank you ever so much, and thank you everybody for turning up as well to these masterclasses. It couldn't be done without you, and it's being done for and with you. If you've got any suggestions as well for future masterclasses, throw them into the melting pot. Whether it's taking something like today and expanding on it, or deep diving into some of those areas, or completely different areas, just give us a shout and at CIISec. And we'll see if we can organize things. And it's been an absolute pleasure again to host one of these masterclasses. Terrific presentation. Thank you for the questions. And I think we're pretty much out of time. Do you want to close off the call at all from a CIISec perspective?
Yeah, so just to mention, we do have another masterclass coming up next week on the 12th of October, which is all around decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs. So if you're interested in that, just head over to our LinkedIn page or email events@ciisec.org. But yeah, thank you, Mike, for a great presentation, and thank you, John, for being a great host, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening.
Super. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.